Hello and welcome to a new video. Today I'm going to be talking about Barbie, world building, and how the way you construct a world can interfere with the message you're trying to tell. Because the movie has come out, once again the internet is mad at a movie, and once again so many opinions are thrown around that I think I might have a somewhat unique perspective on why something doesn't work. Now, before going any further, I would like to clarify that I am aware that this movie is intended to be a feminist flick about why the patriarchy is bad. So I'm not necessarily going to object to that fact, given that's the goal of the director and writer, but more on why the movie does a terrible job at enforcing the messages it wants to tell. Let's go back to 1994 as someone who likes to watch primetime TV. They're sitting on their couch and there's a new episode of The Simpsons. An episode in which Lisa takes umbrage to the totally legally distinct version of Barbie called Malibu Stacy. All of the Malibu Stacys are airheaded bimbo stereotypes. There's not a single one of them that enforces any positive, meaningful role models for little girls. And naturally, Lisa winds her way until she meets the creator of Malibu Stacy, and they start releasing a line of Malibu Stacy dolls that are more in line with Lisa's feminist values. Again, this is in 1994, and evidently the parent company of Barbie, Mattel, has also seen the episode, because since then they've started releasing bolder and bolder Barbie variants. One's more in line with Lisa's values. Now there's surgeon Barbies, there's astronaut Barbies, there's judge Barbies, there's scientist Barbies, there's equine rider Barbies, and so on and so forth. Barbie's no longer just living her best life, now she's also politician, an explorer, an artist, and so on. Meanwhile, throughout the history of the product, Ken has effectively just been Ken. He's an asset, an accessory. He doesn't have any special features or qualities beyond just looking good. So when making the movie, this is really what the directors and writers had at hand as far as the world building for Barbie was concerned. And they decided to then just roll with it. And what happens is that there's this little land outside of the normal world, Barbieland, where all of the Barbies hold positions of power, be it judges, politicians, or even couriers, and Kens are assets that the Barbies would occasionally pick up and utilize when they need, and then discard when they don't need. In fact, it's established in the movie that Kens aren't even able to own a house. They just sleep outside. Now, unlike many writers and directors, I don't think that the people who made this movie are idiots. I think they were completely aware of just how actually fucked up this scenario is. You have a two-tier system, one with all the power, and one who isn't even afforded basic human rights. The problem is, Barbies are female, Kens are males, and they want this to be a feminist film. And despite the mantra feminists so often utilize in the face of groups like men's rights activists, that feminism is for guys too, or protecting guys too, they want to make it so that women are the ones who need to rise up and not the men. So what do? They have Barbie and Ken travel to our world. And when they are presenting our world, they present it in such a cartoonishly over-the-top parodic sexist way where patriarchy is still a thing that's readily thrown around and acknowledged as existing rather than being relegated strictly to either feminist theory or certain parts of the world that are not Los Angeles. And this is where the problems in world building start to mount, because even if our world is supremely sexist as depicted in Barbie, that doesn't change the fact that, like in Barbieland, there are female scientists, engineers, politicians, artists, writers, and so on and so forth. Even in significantly more sexist times, like the 19th century or the early 1900s, you still had extraordinary women like Ada Lovelace, Curie, Mary Shelley, Queen Victoria, and yet there are no extraordinary Kens. One society, both sexes are allowed to own a house, another society, only one is. It is so severely lopsided that the attempts at saying, well, actually, like in the other world, it's kind of reversed, doesn't work because one of them is so significantly more awful than the other. Now, I mentioned before how over the top and parodic the sexist depictions of our world is. Could that not mean that in Barbie, there are no extraordinary women and they aren't allowed to be extraordinary? Well, no, first of all, because there are like human female characters in the movie who have jobs and are self-actualized and able to form opinions beyond what they think a man would think. But it's also the golden rule of interpreting a fictionalized version of our world that everything is the same between our world and their world, unless explicitly stated otherwise. For all you Barbenheimer fans out there, let's use the timeline and history of Fallout's world as an example of this. The opening monologue of Fallout 4 heavily implies that the divergence of timelines between the Fallout universe and our universe started around the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which makes sense given that atomic weaponry is a big thing in the Fallout world. Thus, anything that happened before those bombings must have happened in the exact same way as they did in our timeline. And things that happened after those bombings might be different. For example, in our world, the transistor was invented in 1947, allowing for the miniaturization of technology. In Fallout's world, it wasn't invented until much, much later, which has delayed technological progress in some aspects. President Joe Biden was born in 1942. Thus, indisputably, he must have existed in the Fallout world as well. But it gets a bit more interesting because Fallout is very scarce in information about the early 21st century. Try as I might, I'm not able to find any definitive answers as to who was president and vice president in 2008 to 2024. Thus, it becomes, due to the absence of contradictory evidence, the most likely case that Barack Obama was president in 2008 to 2012, with Joe Biden as his vice president. And similarly, Joe Biden became president in 2020, with Kamala Harris as his vice president. Now, if Fallout 5 is released and they provide information about the political landscape of 2008 or 2020 that establishes a different person was president and vice president of the United States, naturally the notion that Joe Biden was president during these years in the Fallout universe has to be abandoned because there is clear contradictory evidence that indicates that is one aspect of the breakaway between their timeline and ours. Essentially, this is the argument that people who try to defend bad writing and inconsistencies in stories with fantastic arguments always end up running against. All the people who say it's a movie about space wizards for kids, why do you care if the writing is so inconsistent, are never going to be able to overcome this fact. Barbie absolutely has fantastic arguments. There's a small civilization in the middle of nowhere of Barbies and Kens. They aren't even really actually human, they become more human over the course of the movie. There's a shot where a DJ is manipulating the discs, and the discs are flat plastic, no grooves on them, and yet they still produce movies, or still produce music, because that's how the world works. So, not only does the movie not contradict the idea that in our world women have rights and there have been extraordinary women, it directly contradicts the notion that they live in a patriarchy by virtue of the fact that one of the human characters is explicitly feminist, espousing long-time feminist rhetoric. And the problem comes from her attitude toward the Barbie dolls themselves, where she thinks they're just shallow representations of women. They're all bimbo airhead stereotypes. But this takes place in the modern day. And as I've mentioned before, there's been multiple different Barbie variations in which they hold positions of power, authority, and significance. In Barbieland, there's multiple different races of Barbies. There's black Barbies, there's Latina Barbies, there's Asian Barbies. This is a relatively newish development, a progressive development, you can say. Hell, there's even a trans Barbie in Barbieland. And if the Barbies in Barbieland are directly linked to existing Barbie dolls in the real world, which reviewers like Critical Drinker have pointed out exactly how horrific that thought may be, that means that it's likely the Judge Barbies in Barbieland are also Judge Barbies in the real life, some variant of Barbie there. Or the politician Barbies, or the courier Barbies, or any of the Barbies that very clearly have jobs. This character is supposed to be presented as well-informed about the world, and yet she seems to not have taken even the most cursory glance at how Barbies have portrayed women in the last 2 decades. Now, granted, the Barbie that we're following is actually like her mother's Barbie, which probably could have come from a time when they were just airheaded bimbos, but that doesn't change the fact that her complaint is about the nature of the franchise as a whole, and is applying thus to Barbies who are very clearly not supposed to be airheaded bimbos. So the movie fundamentally fumbles at its frequently feminist something else that starts with an F to continue the alliteration. It fucks up. Because no matter how much the movie might want to try to claim that the real world is a vile patriarchy with all the same problems that the Barbieland matriarchy has, no matter how many dude bros might slap Barbie's ass, the golden rules of world building and interpreting a fantastic version of the world, as well as one of the main characters, disagrees with that idea. By all accounts, Barbieland has significantly worse a problem of sexism than the real world, but naturally it just gets worse for the movie. After all, Ken is also in the real world, and he gets to experience the magic of seeing evidence that men are important and significant in the real world. And one of the most amazing things to happen to him in the real world is someone asks him what time it is. He is valued enough, as a man I suppose, in the real world that someone would request him to relay such basic information, as if that was impossible in Barbieland, again firmly establishing how disjointed the sexism in Barbieland is compared to the sexism in our world. He also comes across a doctor and asks to see a doctor, and she, because the doctor's female, says, "I am a doctor," and then he asks to see a male doctor. Are there any Dr. Kens in Barbieland? Because here you have clear-cut fucking proof that whatever patriarchy might exist in the real world is not in any way remotely as bad as the matriarchy or Barbiearchy, if you want to phrase it that way, in the movie. I cannot stress enough how much bringing the real world into this scenario has fundamentally fucked the feminist messaging of the movie. But anyway, Ken learns about the patriarchy and learns about the notion of men being on top in society, and he goes back to Barbieland and teaches that to the other Kens, who immediately, like in a day, managed to overthrow Barbie rule and establish a patriarchy or Keniarchy, however you might want to phrase that. Which is funny because it took significantly longer for feminists to overthrow the systematic sexism that existed in our world. I guess women just kind of suck in general, don't they, feminist movie? I won't go into much detail about the rest of the plot, except that the movie begins and ends with the Ken still not being allowed to own a house. The movie, by virtue of how it sets up Barbieland versus our world, is so fundamentally hypocritical that one cannot help but to conclude that if they're willing to put in an iota of thought about the nature of these two worlds, it fails in every way as a feminist movie. So then, how exactly could the movie have gone instead? Perhaps even in a way that isn't going to piss off half the human race and treat them like absolute pieces of shit. Well, Playboy has had multiple different stories published in it over the years, and in 1955, one story called The Crooked Man was published. It's a dystopian story about a world where homosexuality is the predominating norm and heterosexuality is illegal. It ends with the main character, a straight person, being arrested with the implication that they are going to forcefully rape the heterosexuality out of him. This was a very bold story to publish in 1955 and naturally led to a lot of angry letters aimed at Playboy, but Hugh Hefner's response in general was, if this is wrong, why is the opposite right? Because a story is a very simple role reversal. What if the experiences that homosexual men, the trials and tribulations they face in society, were reversed and now straight people are the oppressed? How would it feel to be on the other side? It's not complex, but it is effective. Barbieland already had that in regards to the roles of men versus women, males versus females throughout history. Arguably more extreme than what existed in history, but closer to historically accurate than not. And if they just went with that, if it was just a story about the supreme Barbie dominance in society and Ken's fighting for rights and freedoms, that would have been directly analogous to the struggles that women and feminists have undergone throughout the years. Yes, I think even modern movie-going audiences would be able to understand the significant and very evident parallels between the Ken struggle for rights and freedoms and the struggle women have had in gaining those over the years. So if it's so damn easy and simple, why didn't they do it? It's because it's a Barbie movie and they don't want to make the Barbies out to be the bad guy. Otherwise, what if audiences don't know you're supposed to be rooting for them and like them? The irony being that given how all-encompassingly dominant and flawless the Barbies are and their society depicted as a utopia despite the very evident human rights issues or Ken's rights issues at hand, it ends up making the Kens who overthrow the Barbies and establish a patriarchy as sympathetic, especially when it doesn't really cause all that many problems for Barbieland as it is. And this is a problem many movies face when making their characters. If they make their characters flawed, they might run the risk of making them unlikable, but they don't realize that people like seeing flawed characters overcome their flaws. If the Barbies started out as sexist and then realized that's wrong and took measures to reverse and account for their sexism, they would actually be significantly more likable, but the movie can't do just that. The Kens also somehow have to be problematic in it, which ends up bungling the message. If they did want to have nuance in the predicament of the Kens and how they establish their rules, what they should have done is have two factions. One who argues that must all be torn down, or total Ken supremacy, or the future is Ken, and there's only 10% of Barbies left in the world compared to modern-day Barbie population. Similar in nature to the eugenicist views espoused by the person who originally said the future's female. And then you have a far more reasonable and democratic and egalitarian collection of Kens who want the same rights, privileges, and freedoms as a Barbie, no more, no less. They want to be able to be doctors and politicians and own houses. They don't want to remove or restrict the rights of the Barbies because they understand how much that would suck for them. So not only would you have a successful role reversal allegory for the struggles that women and feminists have had in gaining rights and freedoms over the years, but you would also present a nuanced and intelligent view of that rights movement, all under the white and pink vibrant banner of Barbie. So yeah, that's why Barbie fundamentally fails as a feminist film, and how it could have avoided failing so spectacularly. I hope you enjoyed the video, that I gave you something to think about and otherwise entertained you. Take care.